Hey, everybody, and welcome to another exciting episode of the Upper Cervical Corner. My name is Dr. Kramer, and we are here working on the discussion of fortifying our nervous system. And so far, we've covered some multiple topics on this, from nutrition to exercise, sleep habits. And today, we're going to start looking more at the environmental stressors that are impactful to our lives. And for many of you, this is going to hit home in a way that you probably have not thought about, simply because it's too simple. I think that's probably going to be the easiest answer for us, mainly because I said it's, too simple for it being simple. But here's the big deal. I was reading this weekend, and this idea came to fruition or maturation because for many of you, a symptom suddenly presents itself overnight. And for many of us, we have been indoctrinated or ingrained to believe that something is incredibly wrong. We need to go to the ER. And then we are greatly disappointed once we go to the ER because there's nothing wrong on an MRI. There's nothing wrong with the blood work. There's nothing wrong with our CT or an X-ray. And they chalk it up as a blanket response. Maybe they call it anxiety. Maybe they say, we don't know what's wrong, and we send you on your way back home. And many of you are concerned and have this note of like follow up with your PCP. And you're like, wait, I thought I was supposed to get help. I thought something was tragically wrong. Now, unfortunately, your health does not fall apart overnight. Now, there are circumstances, right? I have to say this, but a majority of the time, let me preface, your health does not fall apart overnight. And the sentence was written, but it was written more for spiritual stuff. But I thought about this from a health perspective, but it's very fascinating. It says those who lose their health slowly should not be concerned about the quality of their choices, but about the quantity of them. Deep canyons are carved over time by drops of rain. Silently increasing bilge water has the same effect on a ship as a raging storm, and a multitude of small sores can afflict the body as much as a single large one. And for many of you, this is an area or an arena of your life that you have not spent much time thinking about. And that is going to be looking at what you are consuming on a day to day basis. And when I start talking about consumption, the consumption that I am discussing is not what you are drinking, like alcohol. It's not what you are eating, like food, because that's going to go into the nutrition side of life. But what we are talking about is what you surround or saturate your daily environment with. And in this, I have this graph I like to say is this idea of growth versus protection. Because a very famous author once said, you cannot be in growth or protection at the same time, right? You cannot expect optimal cellular and physiological performance when you are immersed in a toxic cesspool. And unfortunately, what we have right now in the Western society is we live permanently in a state of toxic cesspool, right? And what I mean by this is a very, very simple orchestration we can look at. And it is going to come down to the idea of consumption. And consumption in our world is going to go into the form of media. And for many of you, media is going to be things that are going to be related to TV, internet, social, right? You have social media. We can break this down further into this day and age. We're going to go into podcasting, right? You can go into music, you can go into movies, right? We can go into friends, we can go into family. You can look at books, right? All of this makes up the bombardment of the environment that will either put us into a growth state or a protective state. And for many of you, you may be asking yourself, well, doc, what does that have to do with me, right? Well, we said slow drops of water, slow drops over time, right, create canyons. Well, in your life, these slow drops are going to be the media you consume. So over time, if you are chronically desensitized by what you are exposed to from the internet, from social media, from podcasts, music, movies, friends, family, books, out on their games, right? You will begin to program your body to move into this defensive or protective mechanism. And that is going to be embodied by the slow, ever prevailing presence that we start seeing in people of this subtle level of anxiety, right? The subtle level of fatigue, this rate of burnout. You'd see it in also obesity. You see it in the overall decrease in strength of muscular health of people. You see it in an increase in depression. You see this in an increase in chronic illness. And all of these feed into an expression of your neurological health. So many of you may ask us, you may say, hey, doc, I have no idea of trauma in my life, right? As it is in the common sense that a majority of Westerners think of trauma, meaning a car wreck, a concussion, a whiplash injury, something along those lines. But trauma comes in many ways, shapes, and forms. You've had to live through a breakup, a divorce, argumentative parents, alcoholics, drug addicts, right? This idea of this litany of conditions that we are exposed to over time, this will slowly work on this process of positive stimulus of bombardment. Let's just go positive bombardment to baseline neuro function. So if you over bombard your baseline neurological function, you will desensitize the body, right? So desensitize the system, meaning that you have to have a greater stimulus to cause the same function, right, the desired output in order to get your body to work, right? Which is why you see these guys are caffeine addicts, stimulant addicts, alcohol addicts, right? All these things. And so you may be asking yourself, Doc, well, how does that work? Well, it's really, really simple. I'm going to stay focused right here on this little quadrant that I have. In our day and age, we are constantly exposed to fear. It's something that our media loves to sell because if it dies or if it has violence, it sells, right? If it smells, it sells. So their idea of constantly embarking fear upon you is something that generates clicks, ad revenue, etc. for you. So over time, if we are constantly bombarded about a Ukraine war, about the end of the world, about everybody dying from COVID, and if it is may or may not be true, right? It's just this idea of how can we get people to stay attached to our media consumption. Over time, that will slowly begin to have its effect on the body and on your nervous system because you are chronically being exposed to a situation that you have no control over. Is it a bad thing that there's a war going on between Ukraine and Russia? Yes. 150 years ago, you would have no idea that there's a war between Ukraine and Russia, right? You'd be living on a farm, worried about rain or worried about harvest, right? It's in the middle of October right now. So you'd be like harvesting your grains, preparing the fields to plant for the next season, right? That's your biggest focus. The difference here is that one of those things is in your control and the other one is not. However, consumption of media is directly in your control if you choose to let it so. So if you continually subject yourself to social media where you're 3-4 hours a day scrolling through Instagram or Facebook or TikTok, you're going to be exposed to thousands and thousands and thousands of repetitive trauma that generates a toxic cesspool depending upon what you consume. If it is a fear-based media consumption, you will surround your body in an environment of fear, of anxiety, of anger, of toxicity that will put your cells into a state of defense. And you cannot be in a growth and protective mechanism at the same time. Now, if you are chronically in a state of survival or defense, that means you're going to have heightened cortisol over time, which is a chronic disease generator, a chronic illness generator, an obesity generator. It causes massive havoc on the neurological system with an oversympathetic stimulus, heightening your response to being on edge constantly, that feeling of anxiety, leads to the feeling of burnout and fatigue, which interrupts your sleep, which disrupts your ability to have better stress regulation and better health expression. This is the same thing as it comes to music you listen to, movies you watch, books you read, games you play, friends you surround yourself with, and family you surround yourself with, right? If all of those combine to make a 24/7 toxic stimulus, you will continually and perpetually be in a defensive state, which will have no other choice but generating chronic disease and illness for you. Now, for many of you, you may say, well, doc, that's just too simple. And I say, that's fine. That's okay. You may also be asking, well, how is this, related to my upper cervical spine? Well, it's very, very easy when we break this down. If we are bombarding the human body, right, with all this stimulus, there has to be an outlet. And stimulus is perceived by the nervous system, right? Because the nervous system is designed to sense what is happening to my internal and external environment and then giving me a response. And if you are continually attacking the body by what environment you surround it with, you will have a decreased response from the nervous system, right? Also, in this, you have to remember that the nervous system also is a conductor of electricity. That is how it works. So the system takes, the stimulus. The stimulus has to evoke what is called an action potential, and action potentials travel down your nervous system to be received at a certain area. The greater the stimulus, the higher the action potential, the higher the level of awareness it happens, right? If I grab my coffee mug right now, it's not hot, but if I grab a pan off the stove that's been sitting there for 5 hours with a roast, it's going to be super hot, right? You're going to feel that right away. There may be some warmth to the coffee mug, but it's not big enough for me to have a withdrawal reflex. You get the idea. Well, in the human body, all of your neurons in the entire system culminate at one spot. And that one spot is your brainstem. We have talked about this ad nauseum. So if you have massive electrical current flowing in through your brainstem and massive electrical current coming out of your brain through the brainstem, it is the choke point of the entire body. And if it just so happens that this is super sympathetic and stimulus, it is overwhelming or over bombarding the receptor capacity of your brainstem, you will have a malfunction in that area, which will cause a structural deformation of your C1 and your C2 vertebrae. So it's really fascinating when you break this down because people think that you have to have a trauma to change your bone structure. However, your bone structure does nothing more than protect the neurological harnessing of the human body. It's no different than how the wire or the cable that goes to your cell phone is covered in rubber and insulated to protect it so that it can send the signal properly. Your nerves work the same way. They just travel through bone, and that bone protects them from being damaged and allowing you to have optimal performance of signal based upon the stimulus that is received. If that stimulus is overwhelming the innate capacity of the body to respond to it, it will overload the circuit, which will break down the structure that surrounds it in order to protect the brain and the brainstem, right? Like that's the goal of this, right? The body is incredibly smart. God made us really, really amazing. So if we have these symptoms that are accumulated over time from a constant drip of that stimulus that we surround ourselves with, this toxic cesspool environment that we are in, if we do not subject ourselves or remove ourselves from that environment, it will have no other choice but to break down the entire master system of the body, which is the nervous system. And that breakdown can only occur at one area, which is the first and second bone of your neck, because that is where every nerve in the human body has to pass through before it either goes to the brain or it goes to the body. So, in order to explain this in a way that's better for you to digest, you cannot be in growth and protection at the same time. And in the same breath, in the same, discussion, you cannot, and I repeat, you cannot continue to surround yourself with the toxic cesspool of stress that we are seeing in today's day and age. Otherwise, you will continue to see a heightened or a increase in the chronic epidemic of anxiety, of depression, of brain fog, of fatigue, of obesity, of chronic disease and illnesses, headaches, migraines, vertigo, Meniere's disease, tinnitus, all these plaguing conditions that disrupt our normal neurological state of function. Then it becomes our job in the upper cervical world to, one, restore normal neurophysiology by adjusting C1, C2, and also teaching you, the patient, to better evaluate the environment that you are surrounding yourself with, right? Because we're talking about neurological resilience. And if you are surrounding yourselves in an environment that is hindering you, constantly putting you in defense, constantly putting you in protective mode, you will have to change that. You have no other choice, or you will have to continue to sustain the poor quality of health that you have today. So, without further diving into this, let me get over to my without further hindering this idea. The takeaways today are: look at your environment, look at what you are consuming, because what you consume from a media perspective has a great impact on your quality of expression of health. You may need to do a social media detox. You may need to take 90 days off. You may need to just cut the news in general. You may need to evaluate your friends you're surrounding with, or look at your family relationships. And for a short period of time, you may need to protect yourself to allow growth to take place. And you may need to invest in upper cervical care so that we can restore normal neurophysiology, normal cervical biomechanics, to allow proper physiology to take place over time, right? Because nothing gets well overnight, and none of these symptoms happen overnight. That constant, steady drip that created the Grand Canyon is the same constant, steady drip that generates your state or quality or lack of health. Remember, you cannot be in growth and protection at the same time.